She was once banished in disgrace, her name whispered only in scandal. But now, Countess Adeline Whitmore has returned to Fifth Avenue, and with her arrival comes a storm that society cannot ignore. In a world of glittering chandeliers and ruthless secrets, her dignity will be tested, her heart will be torn, and the man who once betrayed her will stand before her again. This is not just a story of love, it is a battle for redemption, for truth, and for the courage to forgive when forgiveness feels impossible. Tell me, where are you listening from today? And share with me, what draws you most to historical romances filled with intrigue and passion? New York City, in the winter of 1887, gleamed with an opulence that dazzled the world. Fifth Avenue, lined with towering mansions of marble and granite, was the proud stage upon which the great families of America displayed their triumphs of wealth. Beneath the glow of gas lamps, carriages rattled over the icy cobblestones, and behind heavy velvet curtains, society prepared itself for another glittering season. It was upon this avenue, after years of silence abroad, that Countess Adeline Whitmore returned. Her carriage moved steadily through the snow-dusted street, its wheels grinding softly against the frozen ground. From within, she lifted her veil and allowed her grey-blue eyes to rest upon the grand facades rising like fortresses of fortune. Her heart pounded beneath the fitted bodice of her travelling gown, yet her posture remained erect, her gloved hands calm in her lap. Society would not see her tremble. When the carriage halted before the illuminated mansion of the Harringtons, where the season's first great ball was already underway, Adeline drew a deep breath. The footman opened the door, and the Countess descended with a poise that belied the storm within her. Murmurs rippled among the waiting guests, faces turned, eyes widened. Whispers flew as swiftly as the winter wind. She had returned. The disgraced Countess, once cast into exile, had dared to walk again upon the marble floors of New York's most exclusive salons. Inside, the ballroom shone with excess. 1,000 candles glittered in crystal chandeliers, their flames mirrored in the polished marble floor. Women adorned in gowns of silk and satin swept through the space like jeweled birds, their laughter high and sharp. Men in tailcoats and immaculate cravats formed clusters of power, speaking in low voices of stocks, railroads, and fortunes. And then the music faltered for the briefest moment as Adeline entered, her presence drawing the gaze of every eye. She wore a gown of deep sapphire velvet, its high collar edged with delicate lace, its long sleeves narrowing to her wrists, where pearls gleamed upon her gloves. The train of her skirt whispered across the floor, trailing like a shadow of her past. Her hair, chestnut with auburn glints, was swept into a dignified knot at her nape, though a single loose curl brushed her cheek. She walked forward with the elegance of one who had once been mistress of these very ballrooms, though every step reminded her of the years she had been silenced. A group of matrons pressed their fans to their lips, whispering with fervent curiosity. Younger women, radiant in their silks, observed her with both awe and hostility, fearful that her beauty might eclipse their own. Gentlemen inclined their heads with cautious courtesy, yet none dared offer more than a fleeting smile, wary of aligning themselves with a woman who had once been judged unfit for society. Adeline felt the weight of every glance upon her, yet her face betrayed nothing. Within her chest, her heart beat with both defiance and pain. She had returned not to beg, but to claim her place once more, though she knew the trial before her would be merciless. As the orchestra resumed its waltz, Adeline advanced toward the center of the room. It was there, in the flickering light of 1,000 candles, that she saw him. Jonathan Hale. He stood across the ballroom, tall and commanding, his broad shoulders filling the perfect lines of a black tailcoat. His waistcoat gleamed faintly under the chandeliers, a gold watch chain glinting at his chest. His dark chestnut hair, brushed back neatly, revealed the first threads of silver at his temples. and his steel-blue eyes pierced the distance with a force that unsettled her soul. For a suspended moment, time seemed to halt. Their gazes met, and the years that separated them dissolved in an instant. 1,000 memories rushed upon her, memories of trust, of betrayal, of anguish too deep to name. Her gloved hand tightened upon her fan, though she kept her chin high, unwilling to reveal the tremor within her heart. Jonathan's expression was unreadable, cold, restrained, yet beneath the surface something burned, an emotion she could not name, perhaps even he could not master. He inclined his head slightly, the gesture both courteous and distant, and yet Adeline felt as though the room itself had shifted. The crowd blurred, the chandeliers dimmed, and there was only that silent exchange between them. Her return, his acknowledgement, and the wound that neither time nor distance had healed. Around them, the ballroom resumed its rhythm, silks rustling, jewels glittering, music swelling, but for Adeline and Jonathan the air vibrated with a tension more potent than any melody. In the hush of that encounter, she understood that her true trial had only just begun. For the harshest judgment would not come from society's whispers, nor from the venomous smiles of her rivals. It would come from within her own heart, where the past and the present collided, and where forgiveness seemed as impossible as forgetting. And as Jonathan's gaze lingered upon her with an intensity that belied his cold facade, Adeline knew that neither exile nor time had freed her from the man who stood before her now. The following evening, the city's grand salons sparkled with even greater intensity, as though the chandeliers themselves had been polished to outshine the shadows of whispered intrigue. In New York, society never slept. It fed upon its own gossip, like fire upon dry wood, each spark fanned into flame by eager tongues. And Adeline Whitmore's return was not a spark. It was a blaze that illuminated every corner of the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue. The Harrington ball had been but the prologue, a startling revelation to those who believed they would never again behold the disgraced Countess. Now the news of her reappearance had spread from mansion to mansion, whispered in parlors, murmured across dinner tables, and repeated with relish by ladies behind lace fans. Some insisted her exile had been spent in Europe under the patronage of obscure nobility. Others claimed she had wandered from city to city, cloaked in disgrace, surviving by favors whispered in darkness. None knew the truth, and fewer still cared. In society's eyes, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the story they could weave and embellish. That night, the grand ballroom of the Davenports was the chosen stage. The ceiling arched high above, painted with scenes of classical triumph, while golden sconces bathed the marble floor in a warm, unrelenting glow. A string orchestra played waltzes from Vienna, and the air shimmered with the mingled scent of roses, perfume, and ambition. The very air seemed charged, as if the return of one woman had altered the rhythm of an entire world. Adeline entered with composure, her presence commanding yet fragile in its solemnity. She wore a gown of silvery satin that gleamed beneath the chandeliers, the fitted bodice rising into a high lace collar, the sleeves draping gracefully to her wrists. Her hair was swept into a severe yet elegant coiffure, softened by a single curl that escaped and brushed her cheek. She moved with quiet dignity, her eyes unyielding even as she felt the weight of 100 stares. The murmurs began at once, fluttering through the room like restless wings. "Can it truly be her?" one lady whispered to another, hiding her mouth behind a painted fan. "They say she dared return unchaperoned, as if the past could be erased," replied her companion, eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "And Jonathan Hale stood at her side last night," murmured a third, her tone heavy with insinuation. "Why would the master of Wall Street place himself so near to ruin, unless he still carries a dangerous weakness for her?" The words echoed, though no one spoke them loudly. Each glance, each smile too pointed, each whisper that faded as she drew near. Adeline felt them as one feels the chill of a draught seeping through walls. She lifted her chin. If they sought to wound her, they would not succeed. She had endured exile, humiliation, the silence of empty ballrooms abroad. This was but another trial, and she would face it with pride. Across the room, her younger sister Beatrice stood hesitantly, twisting the ribbon of her gown between her fingers. Her hazel eyes lit with a flicker of warmth when Adeline approached, though she quickly cast them down, fearful of the gazes that followed them both. Beatrice's gown of pale pink silk and delicate lace seemed chosen to render her invisible, as if she longed to melt into the walls rather than be seen beside the sister whose name carried disgrace. "You came," Adeline said softly, her voice low enough that none might overhear. "How could I not?" Beatrice's lips trembled with sincerity, though her gaze darted nervously to the circle of matrons nearby, whispering with suppressed amusement. "But Adeline, you must be careful. They will not forgive easily." Adeline's smile was faint, touched with sorrow. "I do not expect forgiveness, little sister, only the right to stand here without bowing my head." Before Beatrice could reply, a silvery laugh cut through the air, rich with mockery and intent. Clara Davenport approached, her emerald gown shimmering with sequins that caught every glint of candlelight. A diamond necklace lay heavy upon her throat, and her raven hair was coiled high, adorned with jeweled pins. Her green eyes sparkled with triumph, her lips curved in the smile of a queen, surveying her conquered realm. "Well," Clara said, her tone carrying the softness of velvet and the sharpness of a blade, "what an unexpected delight. I had thought Europe would hold your charms indefinitely, but how wrong I was. It seems even the most distant shores cannot contain a Whitmore scandal." The circle of listeners tittered with eagerness, leaning closer as if savouring a performance. Adeline's gaze met Clara's, steady and unflinching. "I assure you, my time abroad was filled with refinement and learning. But then, Clara, refinement is not something one acquires merely by dressing in jewels." A subtle gasp rippled through those nearby. Clara's smile faltered for the briefest instant, but she recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing with hidden fire. "How brave you are," Clara replied sweetly, her voice honeyed poison. "But bravery is such a fragile thing when weighed against memory, and society never forgets." Adeline inclined her head, her lips curving in the faintest trace of a smile that was not without defiance. "Society forgets every season, Clara. It is too consumed with its own ambition to remember more than what serves it today." The orchestra swelled, masking the tension, but those who watched saw the duel of glances, the battle of words sharpened beneath civility. In that exchange, Clara sought to destroy, and Adeline, with calm dignity, refused to yield. Still, the whispers continued, weaving through the crowd. Some admired Adeline's composure, others relished her potential downfall. A few young men, emboldened by curiosity, approached only to retreat when Clara's gaze cut across them like a knife. From across the room, Jonathan Hale observed in silence. He did not move to her side, though his eyes never strayed far from her figure in silver satin. He watched as Clara pressed closer, her voice lowered, but her hostility unveiled. He saw the faint tremor of Beatrice's hands, the way she glanced toward the exit as if longing to flee. And he saw, most of all, Adeline's stillness, a stillness born not of peace, but of resolve. Adeline knew Jonathan's eyes were upon her. Though she did not look directly at him, she felt the weight of his gaze as one feels the warmth of fire even from a distance. It unsettled her, it steadied her. It threatened to undo the fragile armor she had built around her heart. Yet she stood firm, her every breath measured, her every gesture deliberate. The night advanced with its endless parade of waltzes, laughter, and whispered cruelty. Adeline moved among them as though she belonged, even as they reminded her at every turn that she did not. Each step she took upon that marble floor was a declaration. She had returned, and she would not vanish again. By the time the carriages lined the street once more and the last notes of music faded into silence, Adeline's resolve had been tested by every glance, every whisper, every barb. Forgiveness was not granted in this world of glitter and marble. It was bartered, withheld, or wielded as a weapon. She left the ballroom with her head unbowed, though her heart carried the weight of truths unspoken and battles yet to be fought. For in the ballrooms of scandal, her presence was both a challenge and a defiance, and every soul who had watched her that night knew it. Adeline Whitmore had returned, and her trial had only begun. The winter air outside the Langston mansion had turned sharp as crystal, but within its stately walls, the warmth of golden lamplight and the scent of mahogany, aged leather, and faint tobacco lingered in the air. The great ball had dwindled into a quieter affair. The last waltz had ended, and most guests now sipped liqueurs in salons, whispered in corridors, or laughed in subdued tones near the dying embers of grand hearths. Adeline Whitmore stood alone beneath the towering portrait of a forgotten Langston ancestor, her gloved fingers lightly grazing the folds of her pale lilac gown. Her gaze wandered over the arches of the corridor, her breath soft, as though the weight of her own thoughts threatened to collapse the fragile armor she had worn since her return. A footman passed silently, then another. No one spoke to her now. It was as if the evening had turned and society had grown weary of her presence, yet Adeline did not retreat. She had grown used to silence, to solitude, to being looked at, but not spoken to. And in truth, she preferred silence to the venom veiled behind practiced smiles. She turned a corner, meaning to escape to the conservatory for a moment's stillness. But as she passed the grand double doors of the Langston Library, a quiet voice called her name. Adeline. She halted. The sound of her name, spoken not in cruelty, not in mockery, but with a tension that curled through the air, struck her like an echo from another life. Slowly, she turned. Jonathan Hale stood in the threshold, his figure backlit by the warm glow of the library's interior. He looked every inch the master of Wall Street, composed, powerful, self-contained. But there was a stillness in his gaze, something unspoken behind those ice-blue eyes that betrayed the storm he kept hidden. Adeline met his eyes without flinching. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice even, her chin lifted in instinctive defense. "May I have a word?" he asked. Not as a command, not as an invitation, but as a request weighed with the gravity of years. There was no one in the corridor to witness her decision. No eyes to judge, no ears to repeat. Only the shadows and the past that pressed against them both. She nodded once. Inside, the library was vast and dim, lit only by the flames of the hearth and the amber glow of 2 gas sconces. Books lined every wall, the scent of vellum and ink rising like memory from the shelves. A velvet chaise stood by the fireplace untouched, and a crystal decanter sat on a small table nearby, untouched as well. Adeline stepped into the room with the poise of a woman entering a battlefield. She stopped just beyond the hearth, her posture straight, her gloves clasped at her waist. Jonathan closed the doors behind them. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, filled with the murmurs of the fire and the faint rustle of fabric as Adeline turned ever so slightly to face him. "I wasn't certain you would come tonight," he said at last, his voice low and steady. "And yet, here I am," she replied. He approached slowly, stopping at a distance that was respectful, but close enough that she could see the shadows under his eyes. "Adeline," he began, and then faltered, his jaw tightening. "There are things I ought to say, things I should have said long ago." Her gaze narrowed, and she stepped back a single pace. "Then why didn't you?" The question hung between them, brittle as glass. He drew a breath, then exhaled it slowly. "Because at the time, I thought silence would protect you, protect me." Her voice sharpened like the crack of a whip, though she never raised it. "You thought watching me fall, watching me be cast out, would protect me." His brow furrowed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You think I didn't suffer, that it was easy for me to let them drive you out, to pretend I didn't care?" "No," she said, her tone cutting. "I think you chose your position, your reputation, your empire." He flinched, barely, but she saw it, and it wounded her more than she wished to admit. "Adeline," he said softly, stepping closer now, the formality stripped from his voice. "I was cornered. There were forces you didn't see. Men who threatened to ruin my holdings, your father's estate, your sister's future. I thought—" He paused, searching her face. "I thought if I stayed silent, they'd stop. That if I allowed it to happen, I could keep you safe from something worse." She looked at him then, not just at the man, but at the echo of the boy he once was. The one who had looked at her with something too tender, too raw to be simple affection. The one who had held her hand in secret on that starlit terrace. The one who had disappeared without a word when the rumors began to swirl. Her throat tightened. "And was I safe, Jonathan? In Paris alone, with the weight of disgrace crushing my every step? Was that safety?" He closed the final space between them then, not with a touch, but with a gaze so intense it felt like contact. "No," he whispered. "It was a mistake I have regretted every day." Adeline's lips parted as if to speak, but the words caught in her chest. He reached up as if to brush a loose curl from her temple, but his hand stopped in mid-air. The moment trembled. He did not touch her. He did not dare. And still, the air between them sparked with something fragile and burning. "You have every right to despise me," he said, voice rough, "but I need you to know I didn't betray you. I failed you, and there is a difference." Her breath caught. The fire crackled beside them, casting gold across his face, outlining the sharpness of his jaw, the softness around his eyes that he tried so hard to bury. "I don't know what to believe," she said finally, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "Everything I was, everything I knew, it vanished that night." He nodded slowly. "And I let it vanish, thinking I was sparing you worse. I was wrong." Silence returned. But this silence was heavier, weighted with emotion neither of them dared name. She stepped back then, reclaiming the distance between them. Her composure returned like a veil drawn gently over a wounded heart. "I cannot rewrite the past," she said quietly. "Neither can you." "No," he agreed, "but perhaps we can uncover the truth of it." She turned toward the door, unwilling to let the tears that burned her eyes fall in his presence. Before she reached it, he spoke again. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Adeline." She paused but did not face him. "I'm only asking for the chance to tell you everything when you're ready." She remained still for a moment longer. Then, with the grace of a woman who refused to break, she placed her hand on the doorknob and said, "We shall see if that time ever comes." And with that, she stepped out of the library, her heart thundering, her breath uneven, leaving behind the man who had once held her future and who now held only her unanswered past. The morning light fell pale and uncertain over the avenues of Manhattan, filtered through thick clouds that dimmed the city's splendor. A fine mist clung to the iron railings and frosted window panes, and even the majestic townhouses of Fifth Avenue seemed subdued under the weight of winter. In the drawing room of the Whitmore residence, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fireplace and the faint tick of the ormolu clock upon the mantel. Adeline sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap, the folds of her dark lavender morning gown pooling around her like quiet waves. The view beyond was familiar, yet foreign. So much had changed, and yet the city still pulsed with its relentless rhythm, indifferent to scandal or sorrow. On the tea table beside her lay a folded newspaper, its front page as mundane as always, but within its social column, carefully veiled beneath a cloak of civility, was a paragraph that burned. It did not name her directly, it never did, but it referred unmistakably to a certain lady of fallen favor, now reappearing in society with ambitions cloaked in silk and a gaze fixed upon a financier whose fortunes stir envy in every drawing room. The hand that penned those words had no need to sign them. Everyone knew. Clara Davenport's influence stretched far beyond salons and soirees. It poisoned newspapers, molded reputations, destroyed futures, all with a smile and the flick of a fan. Adeline closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her gloved fingertips together. The library encounter with Jonathan haunted her thoughts like a melody half remembered. His voice, his eyes, the pain behind them, it had shaken her more than she dared admit. But Clara's campaign had resumed with merciless force, and now the city braced itself for spectacle. She rose slowly as the butler appeared in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore," he announced, "your father awaits you in the study." Adeline inclined her head. "Thank you, Hargrove." The study was darker than the rest of the house, lined with high bookshelves and heavy velvet drapes that muffled the morning light. A single oil lamp burned on the mahogany desk, illuminating the worn features of Edmund Whitmore. His grey hair was neatly combed, his cravat perfectly knotted, but his shoulders carried the heaviness of decline. He did not rise when she entered. He merely looked up, his expression unreadable. "Adeline," he said after a pause, "I've heard troubling things." She stepped closer but remained standing. "You've read the column." "I have." He folded his hands. "And I've heard worse at the club. Men speak. They always do. Your name is once again the subject of speculation." Adeline's chin lifted. "Then let them speculate." Edmund's brow furrowed. "That is not a luxury you can afford. Not now, not when our family name has so little left to shield it." She said nothing, but her stillness spoke volumes. He rose at last, moving around the desk with measured steps. "I did not summon you here to quarrel, but I must speak plainly. Your presence has reignited whispers. Clara's reach is vast, and she wields it with pleasure. If you intend to remain in this city, you must consider your position carefully." Adeline's eyes hardened. "Are you suggesting I withdraw again, leave quietly so the world may forget I ever existed?" "No," he said, the word sharp, "but neither can you afford to make enemies, and Jonathan Hale—" His voice slowed. "He is not a man who gives his affection lightly, nor one who involves himself without consequence." The silence stretched, thick and cold. "You believe I returned to ensnare him?" she asked, softly now. "To tie myself to his fortune for convenience." "I believe," Edmund said, stepping closer, "that you are a woman of great intelligence. And I also believe you understand what is at stake. Our holdings are weakened. The estate in Hudson is leased. Beatrice's position is fragile. The wrong alliance—" "Alliance?" she interrupted bitterly. "You mean marriage?" Edmund did not deny it. "Yes, marriage. Respectable, stable, discreet. The city is watching, and what it sees now is a woman unchaperoned, reinserted into society by her own will, whispered about in every parlour. That cannot continue." Adeline turned away, her voice low. "I will not trade myself like a pawn to secure your crumbling legacy. You owe more than pride to this family," he snapped. She froze. Then, slowly, she turned back to him, her expression wounded but firm. "I owed loyalty. I gave it. And when the time came, you chose silence." Edmund stiffened. "You speak as though you know what happened." "I know enough," she said quietly. "I remember the night of my exile." Her voice trembled then, and she walked to the hearth, resting one hand on the cold marble mantel. The memory rose unbidden, fogged, fragmented, but alive. It had been an evening of laughter and candlelight, a masquerade ball at the Langstons' country estate. She wore a gown of soft blue silk, her mask trimmed in silver. Jonathan had been there, his smile unguarded for once, his voice warm, and then the whispers began. A glimpse of them slipping into the garden, a servant claiming to have seen more, a note planted in her reticule, the sudden chill in her father's eyes. The carriage prepared without explanation, no questions, no defense, just departure. She had never been allowed to speak, never permitted to understand. Adeline closed her eyes. "You didn't defend me," she whispered. "I was trying to protect your sister," Edmund said, his voice low, "and your name. The storm was already too loud. I could not quiet it. I thought distance would dull it in time." "But the storm was fed," she said, turning to him, "and someone ensured it would destroy me completely." He looked away, and in that gesture she saw what he would not say. "You knew," she breathed. "You knew who started it." Edmund said nothing. The silence screamed. She stepped back from him, as though the distance might shelter her from the truth. Her father, the man who had always demanded composure, had allowed her ruin in the name of silence, and he still would not name the serpent who whispered in the ears of society. "I see," she said, her voice like glass. "Your loyalty has always been to legacy, not to blood." He turned then, his expression taut. "You are walking a dangerous path, Adeline. I urge you to consider where it leads." She nodded. "I already have." And with that she left the study, her steps echoing down the corridor like a final verdict. As she passed the grand mirror in the foyer, her reflection stopped her. She stared at the woman before her, not the girl who had been exiled, not the countess who had once danced beneath chandeliers, but someone forged by silence, by betrayal, by truth withheld. She would not bend again, not to Clara, not to whispers, not to her father's fear. The shadows of the past had followed her back to New York, but she no longer feared them. She would face them, unflinching, and in doing so, she would become something no scandal could define. The carriage rattled down Broadway with rhythmic steadiness, the hooves of the matched bays echoing against the canyons of granite and steel. The morning mist had lifted, leaving the city glazed with a pale gold light that turned window panes into mirrors and polished brass signs into flames. The streets were crowded with men in frock coats and bowlers, messengers darting between drays and omnibuses, voices calling prices and destinations through the noise of a city hungry for profit. Adeline sat alone within the carriage, her gloved hands resting atop a leather portfolio she had brought more out of habit than purpose. Her gown was simpler than usual, a soft grey wool trimmed in jet, with a velvet collar and mother-of-pearl buttons fastened to her throat. A small netted veil covered the upper half of her face, though she had not donned it to conceal shame. It was protection, an armour of fabric, lace and silence. She had not expected his invitation. It had arrived with no embellishment, no apologies. A note written in Jonathan Hale's unmistakable hand. "If you wish to see who I have become, come to my office. 11 o'clock. No signature, no flourish. Just those words. The carriage halted at the corner of Wall and Broad. Outside, men moved with urgency, newspapers tucked under arms, shoes clacking over stone. From the window, she saw the building that bore his name etched in gold above the door. Hale and Lockwood Investment Trust, its facade commanding, symmetrical, as unforgiving as the world it represented. She descended without hesitation, and the doorman, recognizing her at once, opened the door with a deferential bow. Inside, the world transformed. Gone were the chandeliers and perfume-soaked air of society's ballrooms. Here, the scent was of ink and paper, tobacco and ambition. Desks lined the open floor like military ranks, and young clerks moved swiftly, their sleeves rolled, their brows damp with focus. The hum of commerce filled every corner, punctuated by the occasional sharp command from a man in authority. She was guided through with the reverence reserved for women of standing, though she felt every eye flick toward her, some with curiosity, others with recognition. Adeline Whitmore, in a place where no one spoke of scandals, only numbers. The clerk opened a polished oak door, and she entered a private chamber lined with bookshelves, globes, and one long wall of windows overlooking the restless city below. Jonathan Hale stood behind a vast desk, his coat removed, waistcoat unbuttoned at the throat, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the tension in his forearms. Papers lay spread before him, but his gaze was already on her, not surprised, not startled, simply waiting. "Adeline," he said, his voice as low and calm as ever. You came. I did, she replied, removing her gloves with careful grace. I was curious. His lips twitched into a near smile. About me, about the man who claims to have failed me, she said, stepping farther into the room, but seems to control half the city's wealth. He motioned toward the leather armchair across from his desk. Would you sit? She did, her spine straight, her gaze unyielding. He took his own seat, and for a moment the room held its breath. Beyond the glass, the chaos of Wall Street pulsed, men shouting, wheels clattering, the heartbeat of capital. But here, silence reigned. You wanted to see what I've become, Jonathan said, resting his elbows on the desk. Well, this is it. I command numbers, markets, men. I give orders, and others obey. Adeline tilted her head. And yet you invited me. I did. Why? Because I'm tired of shadows. Her breath caught just a little, but she kept her composure. You said you failed me, she said. You said there were things I didn't know. Now you bring me here. To what end? A confession or another performance? His jaw flexed, but he did not look away. I built this empire to survive, he said. After you were gone, I needed purpose, and power seemed the only way to bury weakness. Her voice was soft. You mean regret? He gave a slight nod. That, too. She rose then, moving toward the window. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass, overlaying the city behind it. I've heard Clara's words. I've seen my father's fear. The more I return to this world, the more I realize that what happened to me, what was done to me, was not the work of whispers alone. Jonathan stood as well, but he remained by the desk. There were letters, he said, his voice low. I was shown one. Anonymous. You and I, after the masquerade ball. Details. Too precise to be coincidence. Not enough to prove falsehood, but damning enough to make even your father waver. Adeline turned, the veil of memory darkening her gaze. You knew it was a lie. Yes, he said, but it arrived the morning after we danced, and by evening the carriage was waiting to take you away. She swallowed. You told no one. I told myself I was protecting you. You were protecting your future. He stepped closer. You were my future. Silence fell again. This time it was not cold. Adeline's voice trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. Someone wanted me destroyed, not merely removed, ruined. Yes, he said, and I was too cowardly to stop it. Their eyes met. A storm passed between them, years of pain, words unspoken, nights lost to memory. She stepped toward him slowly, cautiously, as if drawn by gravity she did not trust. If you had stood beside me, she whispered. Even then, I didn't, he said. She looked down, then up again, tears unshed. Why now? She asked. Why tell me this now? Because I can no longer carry it alone, he said. And because I believe the person who destroyed you may not be finished. The words struck her like a chill wind. He stepped aside, opening a drawer and pulling out a sheet of parchment. He offered it to her. Adeline took it, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the page, anonymous, typed, unsigned, but the phrases were cruelly familiar. The lady is back. Watch her. History repeats. Adeline's fingers tightened. Jonathan's voice was low, urgent. I don't know who sent it, but I received it the morning after the Langston ball. It's not over, Adeline, not yet. She looked up, eyes shining with fury, not fear. Then let it begin again, she said. He watched her, and something in his chest loosened, something he had not dared to name. Adeline folded the letter and handed it back. I will not run this time, she said. I am not the girl they exiled. No, he agreed. You are not. As she turned to leave, her steps were sure, her shoulders unbowed. Before she reached the door, he spoke once more. If I had it to do again, I would have burned the letter and taken your hand. She paused. Then, without looking back, she answered, Then you would have truly stood beside me. And she walked into the winter light, where the world of power and truth now waited. The sea air of Newport was sharpened by frost, and the sky above the cliffs hung heavy with low clouds the color of worn silver. Winter cloaked the coastal mansions in silence, but inside the opulent halls of the Davenport's estate, Rosemore Hall, the season's most anticipated gala unfolded with calculated brilliance. Rosemore stood like a palace carved from ivory, its facade adorned with arched windows and towering Corinthian columns that glistened under icicles and lantern light. Within, no expense had been spared. The ballroom was a symphony of crystal and gold, with a ceiling fresco depicting Olympus itself and servants gliding between guests like shadows carrying silver trays. Strings from Vienna played waltzes in perfect tempo, while the elite of New York and Newport swirled across the marble floor, cloaked in silks, laughter, and expectation. At the top of the grand staircase, framed by the gleam of gilded railings and the hush that fell with her entrance, stood Adeline Whitmore. Her gown was of deepest midnight blue velvet, embroidered with threads of silver that shimmered like frost with every movement. Her shoulders were bare, though not vulnerable, her posture made of steel beneath the soft drape of fabric. Her hair was coiled in a graceful chignon, not adorned with jewels, but held with antique silver combs that once belonged to her mother. Her entrance did not announce itself with noise. It didn't need to. Every gaze turned as if drawn by an invisible thread. She descended with grace, unhurried, as if no eyes were upon her. But they were, and among them burned the gaze of Clara Davenport. Clara stood beneath the chandelier at the far end of the ballroom, draped in crimson satin, her neck sparkling with diamonds that had once belonged to a Rothschild. Her hair was piled high, crowned with peacock feathers, and her green eyes glittered with something colder than envy. She smiled as Adeline approached, a smile that belonged more to a predator than a hostess. "My dear," Clara purred, extending a gloved hand that trembled with concealed intent. "How exquisite you look. I do hope Newport is kinder to you than Paris." Adeline met her gaze with perfect calm. "The sea winds are colder, but the conversation is warmer." A ripple of laughter stirred near them, though it was unclear whom it served. Clara's smile held, but her grip on her champagne glass tightened. The night proceeded in elegance, but beneath every murmur floated tension, like perfume with something sour beneath. Adeline moved through the ballroom with composure, her steps measured, her voice even. Yet she felt the storm gathering in the corners. The glances passed between wives and dowagers, the sharp tilt of monocles, the nervous flutter of fans. Clara's court was restless, hungry for spectacle, and Clara, ever the conductor, was prepared to deliver. It was during the third waltz that the moment arrived. The orchestra struck a softer note, and Clara ascended the dais near the grand fireplace, calling for attention with the tapping of her fan. The room quieted at once, drawn by her magnetism and her reputation for mischief wrapped in silk. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara began, her voice honeyed and lilting, "before we commence the supper dance, allow me a moment to honor an old friend, one who has graced us again with her presence after so many colorful years abroad." A low murmur stirred. Clara turned, her eyes locking on Adeline, who stood near a marble column, her back straight, her chin lifted. "Countess Adeline Whitmore," Clara continued, "whose elegance once illuminated these very halls until it was tragically extinguished." Gasps, stifled but real, rose like sparks. Adeline did not move. Clara's smile was slow and precise. "But time is a merciful mistress, is she not? One might even forget the scandal at the Langston estate, that unfortunate business in the garden, the whispers of an indiscretion involving, well..." She paused for effect. "Some ghosts ought to remain buried, but here they are again sipping champagne." Silence struck the ballroom, thick, suffocating. 1,000 eyes turned to Adeline. She stood alone, unflinching, her face a mask of regal calm. Her voice, when it came, was low, but it reached every corner. "Is this the hospitality you extend to your guests now, Clara?" she asked, not coldly, but with measured strength. "Or merely the performance you promised your mirrors?" Clara blinked. A single tremor at the edge of her perfect smile, then another voice cut through the tension. Deep, controlled. Jonathan Hale. He stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his tall figure impeccable in black evening attire, his gaze locked on Clara with quiet intensity. "That will be enough," he said. Clara's mouth parted, but no words came. Jonathan turned then to Adeline, not to save her, not to shield her, but to stand beside her. His gesture was not grandiose, but deliberate. "I see no scandal," he said calmly. "Only a woman stronger than any among us." Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared, enthralled. Clara recovered, her laughter soft and brittle. "How gallant of you, Mr. Hale, as always." "Not gallant," he replied. "Honest." And with that, the music resumed. Not immediately, but slowly, as if society itself needed permission to breathe again. Adeline did not leave. She remained where she stood, every thread of her being resisting collapse. Her dignity was not armor, it was her very blood. When the crowd dispersed into whispers and polite avoidance, she slipped onto the gallery terrace, where the wind from the sea bit harder than Clara's words. She stood alone, her fingers resting on the cold balustrade, her breath visible in the moonlight. The music behind her seemed far away now, a lie echoing through gilded walls. She had faced the gallows of society and not flinched, but her heart trembled with something more painful than humiliation, recognition. Clara's words had been venomous, but they carried a trace of truth she had long tried to bury. She had not been merely exiled, she had been targeted, and someone close to her had known. She thought of her father, his averted eyes, his unfinished sentences. She remembered the silence in their house after the Langston ball, the way Beatrice wept behind closed doors, the way no one had spoken aloud the reason for her sudden departure. A cold knot twisted in her chest. She had been thrown to the wolves not by strangers, but by those who claimed to love her. The door behind her opened. She did not turn. She knew his footsteps. Jonathan stopped a few paces away. The wind pulled lightly at his coat, and for a moment neither spoke. Then softly he said, "You were magnificent." Her voice was hoarse. "Do not flatter me." "I do not. I only tell you what others will not." She turned then, slowly, and looked at him in the moonlight. Her eyes were no longer guarded. They were fierce, grieving, alive. "Someone meant to destroy me," she said, "and they did not act alone." Jonathan said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. She stepped closer, not seeking comfort, but clarity. "Did you know?" she asked. "Did you ever suspect my father?" He hesitated. "I suspected many things," he admitted, "but I never wanted to believe them." She nodded once, tightly. "Now I do." And in that quiet declaration, the tide within her turned. She would not rest, not now. The masquerade of society had ended, the real dance had begun, and this time Adeline would lead. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the open fields beyond the city, sweeping snow in wild, blinding swirls that erased the road ahead. The horses, spooked and breathless, slowed to a halt at the bend of a forgotten trail, flanked by skeletal trees wrapped in ice. Inside the elegant carriage, the lanterns swayed violently, casting erratic shadows across Adeline's pale face and Jonathan's grim expression. The wheels had slid twice already, and the last jolt had thrown them both to the side with a force that left them shaken, but uninjured. The driver's muffled shouts came through the small trapdoor. "The axle's cracked! We'll have to wait it out. There's a hunting lodge half a mile back, abandoned, but it'll hold." Jonathan opened the door and looked out into the storm. White obscured everything, and the wind bit at his face like knives. He turned back and met Adeline's eyes. "We'll freeze if we stay here." She nodded once, gathering her heavy cloak around her and lifting the hem of her dress. now damp from melted snow. She did not flinch. She did not ask questions. There was only the storm and the man beside her. They trudged through the snow in silence, their breaths visible in the icy air. Jonathan kept close, shielding her from the brunt of the wind, his gloved hand at her back. When they reached the lodge, more cabin than manor, they found the door half broken, but the interior dry and intact. Inside, there was a hearth and stacked firewood miraculously untouched. Jonathan lit a flame with practiced hands, his fingers shaking from cold more than effort. Adeline remained standing, her cloak dusted in white, her cheeks pink from the chill. As the fire caught, shadows danced across the rough wooden walls. It was a world apart from the marble salons and gold-threaded parlors of Manhattan. Here, there were no whispers, no chandeliers, no polished masks, only two souls, stripped of society's trappings, with nothing between them but the truth. Adeline sat beside the fire, carefully unfastening her gloves. Her hands, long and slender, trembled slightly before she hid them in her lap. Jonathan removed his coat and draped it across her shoulders. She did not protest. "It was not supposed to be this way," he said at last, his voice low, hoarse with more than cold. She stared into the fire. "Nothing ever is." He leaned back against the log wall, watching the flames reflect in her eyes. "That night at the Langston estate, I received a letter." Her gaze did not move. "You said so before. But this time, I'll tell you what it said." She turned toward him slowly. The silence between them stretched like the space between a blade and the skin it had not yet touched. Jonathan's voice was steady, but the pain in it was raw. "It named you. Claimed you had tried to seduce me, that you had been seen slipping into the gardens with me, that you carried intentions unbecoming a lady." Her breath caught, but she did not look away. "It was anonymous," he continued, "typed, delivered early before anyone else rose, and alongside it came another, addressed to your father. I didn't see that one, but I know he received it, because when I arrived that evening to explain, you were already gone." Adeline's hands gripped the fabric of her gown. "You let them send me away." Jonathan's voice broke slightly. "I let them believe I had no defense." She stood then, slowly, the firelight outlining the shape of her anguish. "Why?" He rose too, his jaw tight. "Because they threatened everything. They held documents, false, forged, I believe now, but damning. If I spoke, your father's holdings would be exposed. Your family would fall. Beatrice would never marry. Your name would be dragged through every paper from New York to Boston." Adeline's voice trembled. "So instead, you allowed me to disappear, alone, shamed, cast out." He stepped forward. "To save you." "No," she said, retreating a step. "To save what was convenient, what was safe." He faltered. "I thought I could fix it, quietly, that you would be safe in Europe. That time would erase me," she snapped. "Make me forget?" The storm battered the windows, the wind screeching like a warning. Inside, the fire crackled and spat, as if recoiling from the heat now growing between them. Jonathan's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked weary. Not tired, but broken. "I made the wrong choice," he whispered, "and I have lived with it every day since." Adeline felt something collapse within her. Not anger, not forgiveness, something older, sadder, the echo of what might have been. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw a man who had once held her hand beneath moonlight, whose gaze had once made her laugh without fear. That man was still there, buried beneath ambition, beneath silence and sorrow. "I loved you," she said quietly, "and you left me to drown in a sea of lies." His breath caught. He stepped closer. "I never stopped," he said. She shook her head. "You should have." Silence returned. The only sound was the storm, relentless outside, and the fire pulsing between them. Jonathan moved slowly, as if any sudden motion might shatter the moment. He reached out, hesitated, and touched the edge of her sleeve, not her skin, not her hand, just the fabric that cloaked her. It was enough. She did not step away. He looked at her then, not as the Countess returned, not as the exile reborn, but as the woman he had once failed and could no longer forget. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm asking you to see me." Adeline's breath trembled. "I do," she said, "and that is the hardest part." The fire burned low, casting long shadows. The storm raged on, but within those walls something had shifted, not healed, not yet, but cracked open, revealing pain, yes, but also the fragile glimmer of what still lived beneath the ruin. And for now, in the heart of the storm, that was enough. The morning sun rose reluctantly over Manhattan, casting long shadows between the frozen columns of Fifth Avenue. The snow from the night's storm had not yet melted. It clung to rooftops and branches like a shroud, muffling the city's noise in a heavy, reverent silence. It was a deceptive calm, one that wrapped the world in softness while concealment festered beneath. Adeline sat alone in the study of the Whitmore townhouse, her fingers trembling as they hovered over a bundle of old letters she had found at the back of her late mother's escritoire. The scent of faded lavender clung faintly to the yellowing pages, a ghost of gentler times that had long since vanished. She had not been looking for answers, not this morning. She had merely wanted quiet, a place to gather her thoughts after the storm. But fate, ever merciless in its timing, had other plans. The handwriting on the top letter was unmistakable. It was her father's, precise, controlled, and beside it, tucked between folded sheets, was another hand, rounder, more flamboyant, Clara Davenport. Adeline read the first letter in silence, her heart growing heavier with each line, then the second, then the third. By the fourth, her hands no longer trembled. They were rigid, clenched around the truth that had eluded her for so many years. Clara's words were venomous, calculated, suggesting to Edmund that if Adeline were quietly removed from society, it would spare the family greater shame. That the scandal, manufactured and embellished, could be used to elevate Beatrice's marital prospects and secure the Whitmore name against financial scrutiny. Edmund's replies were colder, short, strategic, no protest, no outrage, only compliance. Adeline's breath shallowed. Her father had not merely failed her, he had conspired. And Clara, her former friend, her rival masked in civility, had risen from her ashes like a queen claiming a throne. She pressed her fingers against her lips, the heat of shame and disbelief burning behind her eyes, yet no tears fell. What she felt was deeper than grief. It was clarity, bitter and absolute. The door opened quietly. Beatrice stepped inside, hesitant, wrapped in a pale blue morning robe, her golden hair unbound and falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked younger than her 28 years, more like a frightened girl than a woman born into privilege. "I saw your maid," Beatrice said softly. "She told me you hadn't come to breakfast." Adeline said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the papers in her lap. Beatrice stepped closer, her slippers silent on the thick carpet. "I've never seen you like this." Adeline raised her head slowly, her eyes piercing. "Because you've never seen the truth." She held up one of the letters. Beatrice blinked. Then her face blanched. "You knew," Adeline said, her voice even but laced with hurt. "You knew Clara was behind it, and you said nothing." Beatrice opened her mouth, then closed it again. She began. "I only knew fragments, whispers. Father never told me the full extent, but I suspected. I heard Clara speaking to him once, in the drawing room. It was after the Langston ball. She said things. I didn't understand all of it, but she laughed, and he didn't stop her." Adeline stood. The fire in the hearth cracked behind her, casting light across her features, but it did nothing to warm her. She looked at her sister, not with hatred, but with the ache of betrayal. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked. "Why did you let me go?" Beatrice's hands twisted the sash of her robe. "Because I was afraid. Father said it was the only way, that if you stayed, there would be consequences none of us could survive. I was young. I didn't question him. And later, when I wanted to, it was too late. Adeline's lips pressed into a line. Her silence was heavier than any scolding. Beatrice took another step forward. Please, Adeline. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that father acted out of panic. I told myself that if I didn't ask questions, it would all pass. It never passed, Adeline replied. It defined me. Beatrice's voice trembled. I was a coward. Yes, Adeline said quietly. You were. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but Adeline did not move to comfort her. There were no words that could erase what had been left unsaid for too long. Leave me, Beatrice, she said. Her sister nodded and left. Adeline turned toward the window, holding the letters tight against her chest, as if to keep her heart from breaking further. But it had already broken. Now there was only the shape of resolve taking its place. Later that afternoon, she entered her father's study. Edmund Whitmore sat in his high-backed chair, dressed immaculately in a dark frock coat and dove-grey waistcoat, a decanter of port untouched beside him. He was reading the financial section of the Tribune when she walked in, and only looked up when she stopped directly in front of him. He lowered the paper slowly. Adeline. She said nothing. She placed the letters on his desk one by one. His eyes flicked to the signatures, to Clara's handwriting, to his own. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sat back, the veneer of paternal authority slipping like a mask that no longer fit. You found them? He murmured. Yes, she replied. You wrote them. You allowed it. You made me believe I was the architect of my own ruin. I protected what I could, he said. I made the choice no father should be forced to make. She stared at him, her voice trembling now with fury. You made the choice of a man who feared scandal more than he loved his child. He did not deny it. You gave me up, she continued. You sent me away while Clara ascended, while Beatrice was spared the shame, while you saved your name. And for what, father? Your fortune has withered. Your name carries less weight now than mine, and I... She stopped, her breath ragged. I had to become steel to survive. Edmund closed his eyes briefly, but no remorse softened his features, only weariness, defeat. I did what was necessary, he said. You'll understand one day. I understand now, she said, and I want nothing more to do with you. His eyes snapped open. You cannot mean that. I do, she said, her voice as cold as the marble tiles beneath them. Whatever affection I held for you was buried the day you watched me leave in silence. She turned then, but paused in the doorway. Clara will fall, she said, and when she does, you'll find yourself alone. I will not be there to catch you. She left him there, amid his ledgers, his port, his empty victories. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. The snow had begun to melt, and as she walked down the steps of the Whitmore residence, her heart still heavy but no longer paralyzed, Adeline felt the breath of something new stir within her. Not peace, not yet, but power. The power of truth, the power of choice. The power of a woman who would no longer be defined by the shadows of men. The chandeliers of Hale House glittered with thousands of crystals that caught the light like shattered stars, casting golden reflections upon polished floors of white marble veined in grey. That night, Jonathan Hale's Manhattan mansion was transformed into a palace of winter, with great urns of pine boughs and white roses adorning the staircases, and silken drapes tied with silver cords rippling softly in the heated breeze. Every door stood open, every window flickered with candlelight, and every member of New York's elite seemed to have found a reason to attend the ball of the season. Some came to witness power, some came to gossip, and many came for one reason alone, to see whether the rumors were true. Was Countess Adeline Whitmore truly restored, or was she here to suffer society's final blow? At the apex of the grand staircase, the great clock struck 9. The crowd hushed subtly, conversations fading like the final note of a waltz. Heads turned, fans lowered, and every eye lifted to the figure descending with the grace of a queen. Adeline stood in emerald silk, the colour deep as the forests of old Europe, rich and regal beneath the chandeliers. Her bodice was cut with modest elegance, framed by off-shoulder sleeves, and edged with gold embroidery that shimmered as she moved. Her hair was drawn back into a simple twist, crowned with emerald pins that caught the light only when she turned. No one dared call her scandalous now. She was an apparition of dignity. She descended slowly, her gloved hand resting lightly on the banister, her gaze focused not on the faces below, but inward, where her heart beat steady, defiant, whole. Beatrice stood to one side, pale and tentative in a dress of rose-coloured tulle, her eyes brimming with emotion. For once, she had not melted into the shadows. Tonight, she watched her sister with pride, but also with a silent plea for forgiveness that had not yet been granted. Clara Davenport hovered near the orchestra, encircled by admirers whose laughter echoed too sharply in the vaulted hall. Draped in a gown of ice-blue satin with silver beading, she had dressed as the winter queen she imagined herself to be. But beneath the sparkle, her smile was brittle. Her eyes never left the staircase. She had not expected this. Not the confidence, not the quiet triumph, not the woman she had tried to bury rising from the ashes, radiant and untouchable. As Adeline reached the final step, Jonathan emerged from the corridor beyond the ballroom. He wore black, sharp, simple, impeccable. His cravat was tied in a perfect knot, his pocket watch chain gleaming faintly against his waistcoat. But no jewel shone brighter than the look he gave Adeline. Not hunger, not shame, but reverence. He extended his arm, and without hesitation, she took it. The crowd parted as they entered. Not a word was spoken. Not yet. But the weight of history trailed behind every step they took, and the echo of old betrayal hung in the air like perfume. The music swelled into a waltz, and still no one danced. Adeline and Jonathan stood before the fireplace, beneath the grand portrait of Jonathan's late father, a man remembered for empire but never for kindness. Then Clara stepped forward, her voice lilting over the music like silk over a blade. "What a beautiful tableau," she said, her smile razor-thin. "The prodigal daughter returns, and the master of the house takes her in. How quickly New York forgives when the wine is good and the ballroom is warm." Some guests chuckled nervously, others turned away. Adeline did not flinch. Jonathan did, but Clara pressed on. "Do you all recall the Langston affair?" she asked, her voice just loud enough. "So many seasons ago. A masquerade, a garden, a reputation discarded. We were younger then, but memory clings, doesn't it?" The silence that followed was cold and sharp. Adeline's spine remained straight, her chin lifted, her breath measured. But Jonathan stepped forward and spoke. "I remember," he said, his voice low but clear. "I remember the lies, the forged letters, the threats made against the Whitmore name, and the silence of those who knew the truth and said nothing." A murmur stirred through the crowd. Clara's eyes narrowed. "What are you insinuating?" Jonathan's gaze was unwavering. "I'm not insinuating. I'm revealing." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheet of paper, aged, creased, damning. He held it up, but did not hand it to anyone. "This is one of several letters sent to Adeline's father. It claimed she had disgraced herself at the Langston estate. It was anonymous, typed, but its language, its rhythm, and its lies matched those written by a woman we all know too well." He turned then, deliberately, to Beatrice. "Will you speak, Miss Whitmore?" Beatrice stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "I overheard Clara and my father," she said softly. "They spoke of how Adeline's removal would preserve our name. Clara promised it would be temporary, that Jonathan would forget, that no one would ask questions." The guests gasped. Clara took a step back. "You little fool," she whispered. "You don't know what you're saying." But Beatrice lifted her voice. "I do. I was a coward. I let my sister be ruined so I could be spared, but I won't stay silent any longer." Adeline looked at her, something breaking and mending in her eyes at once. Jonathan turned to the crowd. She was exiled by conspiracy, and I too was complicit. Through silence, a deeper hush fell. I have no defense, he continued, only this. I love her, and I always did. The words hung in the air like thunder, heavy and undeniable. I chose the coward's path once. I will not choose it again. He turned to Adeline, his voice now softer. Will you forgive me? She looked at him for a long, motionless moment. Then she said nothing, but she reached out and took his hand. And in that single gesture, the air in the ballroom changed. A few women applauded. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed. Men nodded subtly, and the orchestra, sensing its cue, resumed the waltz. Clara stood frozen. The color drained from her face. No one approached her. No one bowed. No one laughed. She was no longer the queen. Adeline turned then, and for the first time in years, she walked among her peers without shame, without burden, and without apology. She did not need Jonathan's arm now. She walked alone, proud, tall, untouchable. At the far end of the ballroom, she paused before a mirror. The woman staring back wore the same eyes, the same mouth, but she was not the girl who had once danced through life, oblivious to betrayal. She was more. She was made of fire, and tonight she had burned every lie to ash. Behind her, Jonathan watched in silence. Ahead of her, a new world awaited, and around her, society finally bent, not in mockery, but in awe. Snow fell softly over Fifth Avenue, blanketing the city in a hush that seemed to cleanse even its oldest sins. The gas lamps flickered gently behind veils of frost, and horses' hooves clopped quietly over cobblestones muffled by fresh powder. It was a morning unlike any other, still, reverent, as though Manhattan itself held its breath. Inside the drawing room of Hale House, golden sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching the fine dust of a world restored. The fire burned low, casting amber light over the polished parquet floor and the soft Persian rugs beneath it. The scent of pine from garlands still hanging on the stairwell lingered with the warmth of cedarwood and beeswax. The ballroom, now empty of guests and spectacle, felt transformed, not deserted but sacred, echoing with the memory of a night that had reshaped everything. Adeline stood before the tall arched window, watching the snow swirl past. She wore a deep plum morning gown, trimmed with sable fur at the cuffs, her hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck with quiet elegance. There was no crowd here, no orchestra, no applause. But this silence was not loneliness. It was peace. She did not belong to society's mercy anymore, not to Clara's whispers, not to her father's legacy, and not to the girl she had once been. The door behind her opened, and she did not need to turn. She knew his steps now, firm, deliberate, neither hesitant nor demanding. He crossed the room with the ease of a man who no longer walked with guilt, but with conviction. "Adeline," Jonathan said softly. She turned to him. Their eyes met in quiet understanding. He wore no armor today, no cravat, no black tie, no cloak of power, only a simple charcoal suit and an expression that revealed what even the grandest declaration had not: humility. She waited. He did not kneel. He did not falter. He took her hands gently in his. "I don't come to atone," he said, "and I don't come to ask what I don't deserve." Her heart beat steady. Her fingers, wrapped in his, did not tremble. "I come to ask you to walk beside me," he continued, "not behind me, not ahead. Beside me, as my equal, as my partner, as the woman whose strength shames me and whose forgiveness humbles me." Adeline looked at him in silence. In that moment, no ballroom applause could match the weight of her stillness. Then she answered, "Yes." She did not say it with tears, nor did she soften. She said it with the calm power of a woman who had already chosen herself, and now chose him, not out of longing, but out of love. Their wedding, held 3 weeks later, was not the grand spectacle the city had expected. It was elegant, intimate, and unyieldingly refined. The ceremony took place in the conservatory of Hale House, surrounded by winter roses and ivy, with only those present who had earned the right to witness it. Beatrice stood at Adeline's side, her eyes filled with gratitude and repentance. She wore pale blue and held Adeline's hand for a moment longer than custom allowed, whispering words that needed no repetition. Jonathan's vows were not rehearsed, nor adorned with flourishes. They were plain, spoken from the heart of a man who had lost and found himself in the eyes of the woman he now called his wife. No one dared utter Clara Davenport's name. Her fall had been swift and silent, her invitations dwindling, her name absent from every paper that had once praised her charm. She had become a cautionary tale, a lesson whispered behind fans and teacups, but Adeline no longer listened. That chapter was closed. The city, ever hungry for novelty, now turned its gaze to a different story: the redemption of a countess, the transformation of scandal into strength, the celebration of a love that had risen from ashes. Weeks passed. The snow melted, gas lamps gave way to longer days, and society reshaped its stories as it always did. Yet some truths endured, quietly etched into memory. On an afternoon laced with golden light, Adeline stood once more at the window of Jonathan's private study. The streets below bustled as always, men with ledgers and top hats, women with parasols and purpose. But she no longer watched with detachment. She belonged here now, not as a whisper, not as a warning, as herself. Jonathan entered silently and came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He merely reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. They stood like that for some time, watching, breathing, remembering. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. He glanced at her. "The silence," she clarified. "The letter, letting me go." He looked down at their joined hands. "I regret what I did not say," he replied. "What I did not fight for." "But not the pain?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "because without it, I would not be here, and neither would you, and I cannot regret anything that led me back to you." Her breath caught. Not in pain, but in reverence. She turned to him fully then, one hand on his cheek, the other still in his. "There was a time," she whispered, "when I thought I had lost everything, when I thought silence would be the only voice left to me." His eyes softened. "And now? I have found something greater," she said. "I found myself, and I found you, not as I imagined you, but as you truly are." Jonathan pressed his forehead gently to hers. "Say it again," he murmured, and she did. "I choose you." Outside, Manhattan roared with life. Carriages rolled, steam hissed from grates, church bells rang in the distance. The world continued as it always had. But inside Hale House, in the stillness between heartbeats, a love long denied had finally been given its rightful place. No longer exiled, no longer silenced. Adeline Whitmore Hale, Countess no more in name only, now stood as something greater, a woman triumphant, her past reclaimed, her dignity restored, and her heart, finally, wholly and forever, her own. Spring had come early to Manhattan that year. The trees lining Fifth Avenue burst with pink and white blossoms, their petals swirling through the air like memories. Carriages moved more slowly than they once had, replaced here and there by noisy motor cars that startled horses and offended the old guard. But the rhythm of the city, ambitious, relentless, magnificent, remained. In the heart of the city stood Hale House, unchanged in silhouette but softened by time. Its once imposing facade, once the fortress of a wounded man, was now the haven of a family, one built not of convenience or duty, but of love, patiently earned and tenderly preserved. Adeline Whitmore Hale stood on the stone terrace that overlooked the garden she had planted a decade ago, now wild and beautiful, alive with violets and roses. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and the lines at the corners of her eyes had deepened, but her gaze, strong, clear, luminous, had not dimmed. Her emerald brooch gleamed at her collar, and in her arms she held a letter, creased from many readings. Behind her, the voices of children floated on the wind. "Papa said we could ride in the park if we finish our lessons." "You said that yesterday, William, and I was right yesterday too, Clara." Adeline smiled. "They're twins, named for no one in particular, but loved as though they carried the weight of every ancestor who had ever hoped for peace, were 10 years old, bright, opinionated, and insatiably curious. Clara, like her mother, never tolerated falsehoods. William, like his father, asked questions no one else dared to. They were her greatest joy. A soft sound drew her attention. Jonathan stood in the doorway, still striking in his grey suit, though his once dark hair now bore the quiet dignity of silver at the temples. Time had carved gentleness into his face, where once there had been tension in his jaw and storm in his gaze. Now there was contentment, and in his eyes every morning still began with her. "Reading it again?" he asked. Adeline held up the letter, folded neatly. "Beatrice wrote from Paris. The children are well. Her youngest is learning violin." Jonathan stepped beside her, taking her hand. "She was brave, leaving all this behind." "She was braver still for staying as long as she did," Adeline replied. Beatrice had left New York 5 years after Adeline's marriage. She had married a painter in Montmartre and lived modestly, happily, far from the reach of expectations. They wrote often. They shared every joy. And Adeline forgave her sister's past not because it no longer mattered, but because love had made space for mercy. Jonathan placed a gentle kiss on Adeline's temple. "They're asking for us." "In a moment," she said softly. She turned to look at the city skyline, now pierced by new construction, taller buildings, electric signs. The world was changing, women were speaking louder. The rules that had once broken her were beginning to crack beneath the weight of progress. Some called it dangerous. Others called it inevitable. Adeline called it hope. From time to time, someone would ask about Clara Davenport. Her fall from grace had been swift and final. After her family withdrew support and society turned its back, she left for Boston under a different name. It was said she tried to rebuild her life through charity work, though her name never again graced an invitation or society column. No vengeance had been needed. The truth had been punishment enough. As for Edmund Whitmore, he passed quietly during a winter abroad, his fortune fragmented, his legacy tainted by the choices he made to preserve it. At his funeral, only one daughter wept, and it was not Adeline. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "Do you ever miss the silence?" he asked with a playful arch of his brow, nodding toward the children. She laughed. Full, rich, free. "No, the silence was loneliness. This is life." Below them, Clara and William called again, their voices urgent now, with the need for stories and attention and presence. Adeline folded the letter and tucked it into her coat. Jonathan extended his arm. She took it, and together they walked down the steps into the garden, into the laughter, into the future, into a world no longer ruled by fear or shame. Love had not faded. It had grown roots. And in the home they had built, among the blooming violets and voices of their children, Adeline had found something rarer than a second chance. She had found the life she had once been denied, and she had made it hers. Sometimes the fiercest battles are not fought in grand ballrooms or across courtroom steps, but within the quiet chambers of the heart. Adeline's journey through exile, betrayal, and redemption reminds us that dignity can be reclaimed, that truth always finds its voice, and that love, when chosen freely, not out of duty but of courage, can heal even the deepest wounds. She was silenced, she was shamed, and yet she rose. Her story is not only about scandal and society, it's about strength. It's about the power of a woman who refused to be defined by whispers. About finding your voice again, even when the world told you to disappear. If this story touched your heart in any way, I invite you to write the word triumph in the comments below. That way, I'll know you stayed with Adeline until the very end. You are part of her victory. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves emotional, unforgettable romances, someone who believes in second chances and quiet strength. Your share can help this story travel further, reaching hearts that might need it most. And if you enjoyed this tale, take a moment to explore the other love stories I've left for you in the cards. There's so much more to feel, to remember, to dream. Thank you for walking this path with me. See you in the next story.